I have been sitting with this question for a while now, and I think it is the most honest thing I can say before we start. What if the story we keep telling people about unlimited human potential is actually the cruelest lie we have ever invented? Because we dress it up in inspiration, we package it in book covers and motivational speeches, and what we are really doing is handing people a standard they were never biologically equipped to meet, and then calling their failure a character defect. What if some people genuinely cannot do what David Goggins did? What if the gap between his story and the average person's life is not discipline, but neurology?
That is exactly the kind of question that sounds sophisticated enough to excuse a lifetime of inaction. And I do not say that to be cruel. I say it because Goggins himself asked a version of that question while sitting on a kitchen floor at 300 pounds at 2 in the morning, surrounded by cookie wrappers. The question he was asking was, is this just who I am? And the answer that changed his life was not a motivational slogan. It was a brutal, undecorated truth. The version of himself sitting on that floor was not a genetic destiny. It was the accumulated result of every decision he had made up to that point. And decisions can be changed.
But you are sidestepping the neuroscience, because we now know that adverse childhood experiences, chronic poverty, systemic trauma, these do not just shape character. They restructure the brain. They alter cortisol responses. They affect prefrontal cortex development. They change the literal architecture of how a person processes threat and reward. Goggins did not just overcome bad circumstances. He overcame a brain that was actively working against him at a biological level. Are we really prepared to hold every person to that standard?
No, and Goggins is not asking you to. Here is what the accountability mirror actually demands, and this is where most people misread the concept entirely. It is not asking you to measure yourself against David Goggins. It is asking you to measure yourself against the version of you that is possible and that you are currently avoiding. Those are two completely different exercises. The mirror has nothing to do with comparison. It has everything to do with honesty. And the honesty it requires is this. Are the limits you have accepted as biological actually biological? Or are they the story your brain constructed to protect you from the discomfort of genuine effort?
That is a meaningful distinction, but here is where I want to push harder. Because I think there is a genuine moral question buried inside Goggins' philosophy that nobody wants to address directly. When we celebrate a man who runs on stress-fractured legs, who pushes his body past medical thresholds, who treats physical destruction as evidence of virtue, are we actually celebrating greatness? Or are we celebrating a very sophisticated, culturally approved form of self-harm? Where's the line between building yourself and destroying yourself? And who decides where that line is?
That is the sharpest question you could possibly ask about this philosophy, and it deserves a completely honest answer. The line is not in the body. The line is in the intention. Goggins was not running on broken legs because he had contempt for his own life. He was running on broken legs because he had decided that the version of himself capable of finishing that race was more real, more true, more worth fighting for than the version that stopped when the pain began. The destruction was not the goal. The discovery was the goal. And the discovery happened to require destruction as the price of entry.
But that framing could justify almost anything. Every person who has ever pushed themselves past a healthy limit has a story about discovery and transformation. Every athlete who developed a chronic injury, every person who burned out completely, every individual who dismantled their health in the name of ambition, they all had a narrative about who they were becoming. How do you distinguish genuine transformation from self-punishment wearing the costume of discipline?
You distinguish them by asking what the person is running toward versus what they are running from. Goggins was running toward a self he had never met but could feel existed. A self that was forged specifically in the crucible of maximum resistance. He was not punishing himself for being inadequate. He was excavating himself to find what was underneath the inadequacy. That is a fundamentally different psychological engine. Self-punishment keeps you in a loop. It circles the same wound repeatedly. What Goggins was doing was linear. Every unit of suffering was paid toward a specific destination. And here is the evidence that separates the two. He stopped when the destination was reached. He did not keep destroying himself after the goal was achieved. He calibrated. He learned the difference between productive pain and destructive pain through practice, not through theory.
Let us talk about the 40% rule, because I have a serious philosophical problem with it. The claim that human beings only access 40% of their capacity before their mind intervenes is presented as a universal truth. But that number is not a scientific measurement. It is a metaphor dressed as a statistic. And when you hand a metaphor to someone who is already prone to ignoring genuine warning signals from their body, you are not empowering them. You are giving them an ideological justification for not listening to themselves. What happens to the person who hears the 40% rule and applies it to the wrong situation?
The 40% rule was never designed to override genuine physiological distress. And Goggins is explicit about this in ways that often get lost in the shortened version of the story. The rule is specifically about the psychological ceiling, not the physiological one. The human brain, under conditions of stress and discomfort, generates the sensation of being finished before the body is actually finished. That is not a metaphor. That is documented in exercise science, military performance research, and cognitive psychology. The brain manufactures exhaustion as a preemptive protective measure. The 40% concept is Goggins giving language to that gap between the manufactured signal and the actual limit.
I understand the concept. My problem is the application, because the gap between the psychological ceiling and the physiological limit is not the same for every person in every circumstance. A person with an undiagnosed cardiac condition who applies the 40% rule in the wrong moment is not discovering their potential. They are in danger. So the question I am really asking is this: does Goggins' philosophy require a level of bodily self-knowledge that most people have not developed before it becomes safe to practice?
Yes, completely and without qualification, yes. And I think you have just articulated something that the popularized version of this philosophy frequently glosses over. The 40% rule is not a starting point. It is a destination. You earn the right to push past manufactured limits only after you have developed the self-knowledge to distinguish a manufactured limit from a genuine one. Goggins spent years building that discernment. He failed physically. He pushed too hard and paid for it. He learned through experience where the productive edge was and where the destructive edge began. He is not handing you a shortcut. He is describing the result of a long and costly education. The lesson is not, ignore all your signals. The lesson is, develop the fluency to read your signals accurately. Most people have never tried to develop that fluency because they quit long before they reach the territory where it becomes necessary.
That is a more honest framing than most people use when they talk about this. But it raises a deeper question about who this philosophy is actually for. Because the path you are describing, the years of calibration, the costly education in physical self-knowledge, that path has prerequisites. It requires a certain baseline of physical safety, time, and resources. Is Goggins' philosophy genuinely universal, or is it actually a philosophy for people who are already stable enough to afford the cost of experimentation?
Goggins started that path from a position of genuine instability, not metaphorical instability. He was financially desperate, physically compromised by obesity, psychologically scared by a childhood of real violence. He did not have stability as a prerequisite. He built stability as a consequence of the practice. And I think this is the crucial inversion that your question is assuming the wrong direction on. You are asking whether stability is required to begin. Goggins' entire life is evidence that the practice itself generates the stability, not the other way around. Every person who waits until circumstances are favorable enough to begin is simply using favorable circumstances as a more sophisticated version of the excuse they would have made anyway.
Taking souls. I want to examine this concept very carefully because on the surface it sounds empowering. But when I look at it more closely, I see something that troubles me. The idea that you respond to adversity by psychologically dominating the situation, by performing so completely that your oppressor loses the will to continue. That is a framework that centers your response entirely on the other person. It is reactive, not autonomous. You are still defining your performance in relationship to someone else's attempt to break you. Is that genuine inner strength, or is it just a more aggressive form of external validation?
That is a genuinely penetrating observation, and I want to sit with it for a moment before I respond, because it deserves that. You are correct that on the surface, taking souls appears to be a relational concept. It appears to require an adversary, but the mechanism Goggins describes is not actually about the other person. The other person is the occasion, not the destination. What taking souls really describes is the practice of converting external pressure into internal fuel at a high enough rate that the source of the pressure becomes irrelevant. The instructor pouring ice water on Goggins at 3 in the morning was not the point. The point was what happened inside Goggins when he chose, in that specific moment, to perform rather than to endure. The performance was not for the instructor. The performance was proof of concept to himself.
But in the book, Goggins explicitly talks about watching the instructor's face change, about wanting that specific person to feel his resilience. That is not internal. That is interpersonal. He is measuring his own victory by its effect on another person's psychology.
You are right, and I think what that reveals is something honest about human psychology that a cleaner philosophical framework would try to hide. We are relational creatures. We locate ourselves partly through contrast with others. Goggins is not pretending to be a monk who has transcended the need for any external reference point. He is describing how he weaponized a very human, very relational instinct, the need to be seen as unbreakable, and used it to generate performance under conditions where pure internal motivation might have flickered. The taking souls concept is not a description of perfect psychological independence. It is a description of how to harness every available resource, including relational and competitive ones, when you are operating at the edge of your capacity. Purity of motivation is a luxury. Goggins was not operating in luxury.
I respect that answer because it does not try to make Goggins into something cleaner than he is. But here is the question it generates for me. If the practice of mental toughness is partly built on relational and competitive fuel, what happens when that fuel runs out? What happens when there is no instructor, no adversary, no external pressure? What sustains the performance when you are genuinely alone with no one to take a soul from?
The cookie jar. And this is where that concept becomes not just a motivational tool, but a philosophical answer to exactly the question you are asking. When there is no external adversary, you reach into the accumulated record of your own survival and you compete with the version of yourself that has already overcome something genuinely hard. You are never truly alone with no reference point. You carry your entire history with you. Every time you survived something you thought would break you, that survival became a part of your internal architecture. The cookie jar is the practice of making that architecture accessible under pressure. It is how the external fuel, the adversaries, the instructors, the critics, eventually becomes unnecessary because you have built enough internal evidence of your own capacity that the evidence itself becomes the engine.
I want to go somewhere that I think cuts to the philosophical heart of everything we have been discussing. The concept of callousing the mind assumes that the human capacity for suffering is a resource to be developed rather than a wound to be healed. But there is an entire tradition of psychological thought that says the opposite. That the healthy response to pain is not to harden against it, but to process it, integrate it, and allow it to inform your choices without controlling them. Is Goggins' philosophy in direct conflict with psychological health? Are we asking people to do something that is fundamentally anti-therapeutic?
This is the most important tension in the entire philosophy, and Goggins himself lives inside it rather than resolving it neatly. He does not claim to be psychologically whole. He is not presenting himself as a model of integrated emotional health. He is presenting himself as evidence of what is possible when a person refuses to let their wounds be the final word on their capacity. Those are two different projects. Therapeutic integration asks, how do I make peace with what happened to me? Goggins is asking, how do I refuse to let what happened to me place a ceiling on what I can become? You can believe both questions are valid and still recognize that they are not the same question.
But does pursuing one actively prevent you from pursuing the other? Because a mind that has been calloused, that has been repeatedly conditioned to override pain signals and push through discomfort, is that mind still capable of the kind of vulnerable, receptive processing that genuine psychological healing requires? Or does the callous, by definition, reduce your capacity for that?
Goggins' own account suggests that the callousing process and the healing process are not sequential but simultaneous, and that the callousing is sometimes what makes the healing possible rather than what prevents it. He did not process his childhood trauma by sitting quietly with it until it resolved. He processed it by moving through it at a speed and intensity that forced it to yield something useful. For him, action was the therapeutic mechanism. Not reflection in stillness, but reflection in motion. Now, that is not a universal prescription. Different psychologies require different approaches. But the assumption embedded in your question, that callousing is categorically opposed to healing, may itself be a culturally specific assumption about what healing is supposed to look like.
That is a genuinely interesting reframe. So the argument is that Goggins did not bypass his trauma by callousing through it. He processed it through the specific medium of extreme physical and psychological challenge.
Exactly. And the evidence for that reading is that he wrote the book. A man who had simply numbed himself to everything does not write 300 pages of raw, detailed, emotionally specific autobiography. He wrote it because the process unlocked something rather than sealing something off. The callous was not a wall built against feeling. It was a structure built to allow him to feel without being destroyed by the feeling.
But that argument proves too much. By that logic, any amount of risk is justified because the cost of inaction is also real. That cannot be right. There must be a legitimate threshold below which the risk of a particular failure genuinely outweighs the cost of inaction.
There absolutely is a threshold, and Goggins does not tell you where it is for your specific life because he cannot know that. What he offers is a methodology for making that assessment honestly rather than fearfully. The after-action report, which is essentially Goggins' framework for processing failure, is not a tool for celebrating recklessness. It is a tool for ensuring that every failure yields its maximum possible intelligence. The question is not whether to risk failure. The question is whether you are capable of looking at failure without flinching when it arrives, extracting everything it has to teach, and returning with that knowledge intact. Most people cannot do that, not because they lack the intelligence, but because they have never practiced sitting with failure long enough to hear what it is actually saying.
And what does failure say at its most fundamental level? When you actually sit with it long enough to listen?
It says that you were close enough to something real to lose it. And that is not an indictment. That is a geography. It tells you that you were in the territory where the thing you were trying to build actually exists. The people who never fail at anything significant are not safe. They are simply never in the territory. Goggins' entire life is a map drawn in failure. Every time he went back to that map, he was able to navigate further. Not because he stopped caring about the cost of getting it wrong, but because he decided that the alternative, the life lived entirely outside the territory of genuine risk and genuine effort, was a form of failure so total and so permanent that it made every other kind look manageable.
Collins, I came into this conversation prepared to dismantle this philosophy, and I have asked every hard question I could construct. And what I am left with is this: Goggins is not offering a blueprint. He is offering a mirror. And the mirror does not show you who you are supposed to become. It shows you the gap between who you currently are and who you are capable of being. And it asks you, without mercy and without comfort, what you plan to do about that gap.
That is it. That is the entire book. And the only thing standing between you and the answer is the willingness to look at the reflection without negotiating with it. Goggins stood in front of that mirror at 300 pounds with a broken past, in a kitchen that smelled like cockroach spray, and he looked at himself without mercy. Not because he hated himself, because he respected the version of himself that was possible enough to refuse to let the current version be the final word.
Then I know what I need to do tonight.
You have always known. That is the hardest part of all of this. The mirror does not tell you anything you did not already know. It just makes the knowing impossible to ignore. The gap between who you are and who you are capable of becoming is not closed by inspiration. It is closed by the willingness to look at yourself clearly, to move when movement is painful, and to return every single time you fall without letting the fall become the final chapter. The mirror is waiting.